the darkest age ever yet to befall mankind. Ramses' state would survive the collapse, turning back the sea peoples on the Nile, making a wall of ships and spears to block their advance. Tellingly, a chariot is present on the battlefield, but not integral to victory. A sign of the times. Despite Ramses' victory, this was a battle which signalled the downfall of the Egyptian state. It was to be a slow, lingering death, leaving their colossal remains empty, decaying all across the land. Doomed to irrelevance, the only Bronze Age power left in an uncertain new age of iron. For after the 12th century BC, for at least a century or more, there were no cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Scholars have debated for close to 200 years as to the identity of these elusive invaders and to their exact nature. Where did they come from? And where did they go? Were they grizzled veterans, mercenaries opportunistically going to war? Some, no doubt, having fought on the sea for decades by the time they got to Egypt. Or a mass migration from the west. The survivors of destroyed civilizations, banding together out of necessity. For this was the age of the late Bronze Age collapse. Until this time, the most devastating societal breakdown in history. The first true interruption since the city builders of ancient Sumer some 3,000 years before. Though we can never know for certain what drove the Sea Peoples, or even, for the most part, the lives they led, the battles they fought. The record is simply too sparse. However, using the very latest archaeological, genetic, climatological, and historical research, we can form a most basic picture of who they might have been. Telling the late Bronze Age collapse from their point of view. Hello, and welcome to History Time. This is a 2-hour deep dive into the epic world of the late Bronze Age, and those sea-born warriors who contributed to its end. I'm your host, Pete Kelly. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell notification so you can access the library of other history videos on this channel and be updated on new projects in the future. History Time is a one-man team, so don't forget to leave a like and a comment to feed YouTube's algorithm, making this gigantic project worthwhile and others like it in the future possible. Shortly, we'll return to the end of the Bronze Age to investigate the origins and everything we know about each and every one of the Sea Peoples. But first, a Venice of the Bronze Age world. A powerful city-state. Its kings rich and respected. Trade links and diplomatic allegiances extending all across the known world. Then, a little over 3,000 years ago, all that came to an end. When excavated in the 20th century, it soon became apparent what caused Ugarit's end. Hastily scrawled cuneiform tablets being discovered here, still in the kilns that they'd been fired in. The last written messages of this land for hundreds of years. burned along with the city that made them, before they could ever be sent. The picture painted here by those records is a bleak one. The warriors of the city were away, fighting in foreign lands. The ships of the enemy patrolling the coast at will, getting ever closer to the city itself. The year was around 1180 BC, and according to those desperate SOS messages, by this time the Hittite world to the north was already dead. And so soon would be Ugarit. As we have already seen, the Egyptian sources talk of a great mustering at this time in the seas around Cyprus, then known as Alasea. A seaborne threat coming out of their many islands, presumably those of the eastern Mediterranean that they'd recently overwhelmed. We know from archaeology that this was a region ravaged by violence and chaos. All around the coast of this once peaceful sea, the story is the same. Once decadent, vibrant societies of the shore, retreating inland to hilltop fastnesses. Populations dwindling, crops failing, cities abandoned, some never to be rebuilt again. Further north and to the west in the Mycenaean world, great kings had once engaged economically all over the Mediterranean, their warriors seeking service as retainers in the armies of prosperous kings. But now their palaces burned, their cities destroyed. To the east too, in the Euphrates River Valley, home to the first true cities of the world, hordes of enemies are said to have ravaged the land. This was bad news. If Babylon fell, so too would fall the access to tin, one of the main components in the bronze used by kings to retain their power. The bronze that kitted out armies, that in a world before coinage paid followers. The bronze that kept the world in check. Without it, everything would fall apart. The king's power gone in an instant. During the late Bronze Age, the vast majority came from what is now Afghanistan, carried by traders along the ancient Silk Road into Mesopotamia, where Kassite Babylon passed it along to Egypt, Hatti and Greece. The great city of Babylon would survive for a time, beleaguered as it was. But by 1158 BC, the neighbouring king of Elam, the old enemy of Mesopotamia, had long promised to see the city burn. And in that year, he did it, laying waste to the land between the two rivers, cutting off the tin trade to the east and leaving just Assyria and Egypt intact out of all the great powers of the Bronze Age. In Anatolia, Syria, even across the sea in mainland Greece, every major settlement met its end, torn asunder along with the trade system once enjoyed by Egypt. In Greece, the record simply goes blank. Events later half remembered by bardic poetry such as the Iliad, written down much later. Here, there would be no verifiable contact with the outside world for hundreds of years. The palatial world of powerful individual personalities interacting with each other on behalf of entire kingdoms and empires would give way. to one of many warriors, illiterate chieftains and warlords, whose words, actions, and motivations are lost to us today. But what caused the collapse? Was it invasion by the elusive Sea Peoples? Perhaps not too dissimilar to the 4th century Germanic barbarians embedding themselves within the late Roman Empire, whilst simultaneously laying it to waste. Indeed, the evidence does seem to suggest that for the first time, armies of infantry on the periphery of the Bronze Age world had worked out how to defeat chariot warriors. Now having the technology and expertise to do so. All of Egypt's great cities lay on the Nile. If they could break through there, they would have been able to take over the whole kingdom, or at least plunder its cities. However, it remains a debated point whether the Sea Peoples were directly responsible for the collapse. Ours weren't individual kingdoms, but a linked-up system. Topple one, and the rest can easily fall. So then, what was the catalyst? In the last few decades, recent developments in science have enabled researchers an entirely new way of looking at the past. And the picture they get in the 13th and 12th centuries BC is one of disaster on a massive scale. We know from contemporary sources that famine racked the land. And now we may know why. For this was an era of unprecedented drought. So much so that in many areas, rainfall seems to have dropped so much that there was no longer enough left to sustain agriculture. In many areas where crops had once bloomed, the ground became desert. In highland regions like Hatti, easily defensible in good years, those suffering from a lack of water at the best of times, the result could have been world-ending. And it may be that this environmental crisis was felt all over Europe and beyond, creating mass population movement. And then we have the earthquakes. According to seismology, the 12th century BC was awash with them. All over Greece, Anatolia, Syria and the Levant. But tellingly, not in Egypt, where imperial administration. There's another argument too, one based on access to resources. Most states in the late Bronze Age had their own small copper mines, though it was often difficult to mine. There was one place, however, with an abundance, practically falling out of the ground, so much so that the place may have been named after it: Cyprus. The effects of Cyprus falling to the Sea Peoples could have been devastating, though not as much as the loss of tin, the other metal needed for bronze. Tiny tin mines did exist in Italy, Spain, Anatolia, and a fair amount in far-off, inaccessible Britain, no doubt making their owners incomprehensibly rich. But mostly the trade came from Afghanistan, some 3,000 kilometers away. By the 12th century BC, however, a new metal was beginning to be utilized. A sign of a new age to come. Iron. first used around 3000 BC. But not in massive amounts. Iron is much more difficult to smelt than copper or bronze, needing heats of over 1500 degrees. The upside, however, was that this metal could be found everywhere, a great leveller, allowing new elites to form, and the result, the destabilization of the entire world. So then, by 1200 BC, spurred on by crisis after crisis, a new order was arising. It may well be that starving people from countryside areas rose up to sweep in and burn their own cities to the ground, removing the upper stratums of society entirely, to be replaced with something else, helped along the way by sheer desperation and, just maybe, access to weapons and arms only previously held by the elite. So, it may well be that the pre-existing populations of the Eastern Mediterranean were just as responsible for the collapse as the underworld of pirates and raiders, long spoken of at the edges of the Bronze Age system, who now took advantage to raid on a scale never seen before. Particularly given the enmity usually felt between common people of different regions. Hittites and Mycenaeans in particular seeming to be engaged in a cold war, lasting centuries. Like Vikings in the early Middle Ages, these raiders could have launched surprise hit-and-run attacks, always striking when the enemy is weakest. To a certain extent, some of the Sea Peoples may well have been former citizens of the Bronze Age powers. There's some evidence of this too. In Greek myth, relating events before the Dark Age, Odysseus' 10-year wanderings across the world following the Trojan War saw him travelling to Crete, Egypt, Lebanon and Libya, before finally returning to Ithaca to find the place in turmoil. Menelaus of Sparta had a similar 8-year journey back. Odysseus even reminisces about 7 years spent in service to the Egyptian pharaoh, working on retainer for cash, following unsuccessful attacks on the country. Indeed, much of the archaeological finds linked with the so-called Sea Peoples are Bronze Age Aegean in style. Yet, surely, this wasn't just military expansion. There is evidence to suggest that population movement was happening on a massive scale. Forced to flee from wherever they came from by drought, environmental devastation, economic and societal turmoil, and warfare. The fringes of the Bronze Age world, in comparison, in the far east and west, where some of these invaders may have originated, were wilder, less organised lands. And now, it is to the Western Mediterranean that we must look. When Frenchman Jean-François Champollion began studying the ancient edifices of Egypt in the early 19th century, just brought into the ascendant French Empire under Napoleon, he couldn't have fathomed the immense antiquity displayed on those surfaces, hidden within long-forgotten tombs. For these were hieroglyphics, and when finally, after dedicating his entire life to the study of those ancient symbols, their secrets were finally unlocked due to the Rosetta Stone, the long-held secrets of ancient Egypt could finally be read, offering an unprecedented window into an ancient world. In the ensuing decades, much was learned. Immense dynasties rising and falling one after another over thousands upon thousands of years. Archaeology undertaken by the great Flinders Petrie and the like. One by one, ancient cultures began to be filled in on the map, beginning to show a complicated patchwork of kingdoms and empires. Long thought to be a biblical fantasy, the Hittites held out the longest, before their texts too were unravelled, allowing us another window into the Bronze Age world. Yet, one glaring mystery still remained, that of the nations who ended that world. It was quickly realised that such a collapse happened, but who caused it and where they had come from became a subject of intense debate. In 1855, French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouge was the first to use the term peoples of the sea when describing the nations depicted at Medinet Habu. It was a scholar of the next generation, however, Gaston Maspero, who popularised the term, noting that most of the 9 nations mentioned in the Egyptian sources came from the sea on ships. Also associating it with the popular migration theories of the time, which related to the origins of the Germanic peoples of Europe, and others. A theory which in the last few decades has been intensely scrutinised by many scholars. Indeed, these 9 bows raised against Egypt, as they are sometimes referred to in the Egyptian sources, didn't all come from the sea. And certainly their actions weren't always there, cities being sacked far inland in Anatolia, Syria, Greece, and Mesopotamia even. Babylon was destroyed by Elamites. We know Egypt was attacked across the western desert from Libya, probably from Nubia in the south, and certainly from the east across the Levantine shore. Greece and Anatolia weathered attacks from the north, from Phrygians, Thracians, and perhaps Dorians, the later inheritors of the Mycenaean world. Yet still, the evidence of the sea peoples arriving on boats is unquestionable between the eastern Mediterranean and the west. First with small items found in the burgeoning towns of Iberia, and even further past the Straits of Gibraltar north to Britain, known as the Tin Isles, before eventually expanding into a network of ocean-facing metropolises. Ultimately, advances in rigging and shipbuilding technology were the secret innovations that spawned this expansion. However, in recent years, it's increasingly thought that these new types of ships, allowing for easier and longer journeys, actually developed earlier, towards the end of the Bronze Age. Allowing for cheaper and easier vessels to be built. No longer did ships have to cling to sea shores. There's no denying the Phoenician expansion was unprecedented. However, given this earlier innovation in shipbuilding technology, surely they weren't the first seafarers to make the journey across the open sea. Earlier peoples doing the same thing, but on a more localized, less organized level. The Mediterranean is a relatively stable sea, not beset by as many storms as an open ocean like the Atlantic. In fact, sea travel is thought to have first begun during the Stone Age. Thousands of years before the Phoenicians. We know from archaeology that wide-reaching trade took place for millennia, with ships mostly hugging coastlines. But every now and again, longer journeys must have taken place. We have evidence of this beginning in the Chalcolithic era, with upwardly mobile coppersmiths of the Beaker people, ranging far and wide across the continent, to Ireland, Britain, and Scandinavia, spreading the art and magic of metallurgy wherever they went. In Spain, we have a massive Chalcolithic settlement, populated by many thousands of people. At the time, this was a world not far behind parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. And in this ancient age, particularly in the 2nd millennium BC, knowledge was power. Traders with access to the outside world could easily become chieftains and kings, able to reward loyal followers with exotic goods from far away. Those who held river routes and coastlines could exact tributes, and thus the wealth and luxury of the East slowly filtered in to the West, bringing it too into the interconnected system that had evolved over thousands of years. Faced with the luxuries coming in from the East, the outside world naturally wanted in. But what happens if the trade stops? The wanderers who previously came to your river no longer come. Such as may have happened in the 12th century BC. Surely some would go looking for the source. The prosperity of the city builders ultimately contributing to their demise. We know from in the Amarna letters 200 years before, Sheridan of the Sea are specifically mentioned as swords for hire, working on behalf of a client king, Rib-Had, as part of an Egyptian garrison at Byblos. They appear again during the 2nd year of Ramses II's reign, launching an unsuccessful attack on the Nile that he recorded for posterity at Tanis Stele II. A number of these pirates were captured, perhaps forced into service in the Egyptian army. And no doubt other attacks were launched too. The situation can easily be interpreted as one of bold attacks from the sea, on a wider scale than ever seen before. Like Vikings during the early Middle Ages, small bands at first of just a handful of ships, eventually spiralling into much more. Their prey, the lucrative economic system of the city builders. On a good year, when the great powers were strong, attacks could easily be repulsed. During darker times, not so much. Of course, the military prowess of the newcomers was quickly recognised, and when offered access to the riches of the East, no doubt many flocked to sign up in service to Egypt, to Ramses II and his successors. Notably, whilst some Sherden fought in the coalition against Egypt during the reign of Meneptah, others remained loyal, fighting fiercely for the king. There is even ample evidence of Sherden being settled in Egypt, with land and goods specifically allocated to them. Like Germanic soldiers in Rome, they often had elite status in Egyptian society and within the army. According to the papyrus Amion, they were even allocated land directly adjacent to the temple at Karnak, an especially important place. And later still, during the 20th dynasty, under Ramses XI, long after the collapse, Sherden mercenaries were still being utilised in Egyptian armies, spoken of in administrative documents. A relationship that had lasted more than 300 years. But who were the Sherden? Like all of the Sea Peoples, there is much speculation, not much fact. And today, we have at least 4 main hypotheses: Western Anatolia, the Semitic East, the Ionian coast, and the Western Mediterranean. One of these, however, favoured by scholars such as Giovanni Ugas, does have some archaeology to go on. Sardinia. Picturesque jewel in the centre of the Mediterranean, just off the coast of Western Italy. Home to one of the most mysterious, little understood cultures of the ancient world. For this is the land of the Nuraghi builders. Colossal towers and sprawling complexes that still dominate the landscape today. The largest of these structures to survive to the present incorporated 5 massive central towers, reaching heights of 30 metres, completed by multiple outer walls and dozens of additional towers. Early Greek geographers were so perplexed by these structures that they speculated links to the ancient labyrinth builders of Crete. Later, archaeologists too suspected origins in Greece. Today, we know that this was a tradition native to the island. Their construction beginning in the 2nd millennium BC of the suggesting at least a cultural expansion, if not demographic. A somewhat similar culture existing in Iberia too. And Sardinia was a land rich in metal, of copper and lead, seeing the mass construction of furnaces to produce and ship alloys all across the Mediterranean. Placed roughly in the middle of the sea, with access to east and west, Sardinia, though mostly missing from the written record, must have been an important and rich land. Archaeology tells us that these Bronze Age Sardinians became especially skilled metal workers, producing a wide variety of bronze objects, such as swords, daggers, axes, pins, rings, and bracelets. Most fascinating of all, however, are these unique bronze statuettes, depicting warriors and boats. Suggesting a close relationship with the sea, perhaps representing a native warrior aristocracy. These statuettes, with horned helmets and round studded shields, bear more than a striking resemblance to those depicted in the Egyptian sources. And then we have the archaeology from lands far away. Tin, one of the main ingredients for making bronze, is an especially scarce resource, as we have seen, only occurring in significant amounts in southern Britain, Iberia, and far-off Afghanistan. However, there is some evidence to suggest that it was mined in Sardinia too, in at least one site, as well as copper and lead. This might explain the significant archaeological links found in recent years with the Mycenaean world. A rich land, poor in metal. So then, there was a link with Greece after all. So-called gateway communities having been located on Cyprus, Crete, and in Greece, all containing items originating in Sardinia, and vice versa. Nuragic ceramics dating to the 13th century BC have been found at Tiryns, Komnenos, Kokino Kremos in Sicily, at Lipari, and in the Agrento area, all the way along the sea route linking western to eastern Mediterranean. And other cultural links to Bronze Age Greece are found too, with the adoration of bulls and the shape of common tholos tombs. Cyprus-type copper ingots have been found in Sardinia too, as well as Nuragic ceramics in the Aegean, Cyprus, in significant amounts in Spain, and at sites on the Italian mainland. And it wasn't just the Mediterranean that Sardinia's links extended to. We already know that the amber found in such famous pharaohs as Tutankhamun's tomb had its origins in the far northern Baltic Sea. And in 2013, a study of 71 Swedish items from the Nordic Bronze Age revealed that the vast majority of the copper utilised came from Sardinia and the Iberian Peninsula. And tellingly, this so-called golden age of Nuragic civilization didn't end in the 12th century BC, extending for hundreds of years afterwards, perhaps coinciding with the apex of population. There is evidence here of growth and a continuation of this culture for many hundreds of years to come. Before conquest by a new incoming people from the Levant, the Phoenicians. In 1974, archaeologists stumbled upon a number of broken pieces of stone littering an ancient hilltop. Painstakingly pieced back together, these 2.5 meters tall statued menhirs. Looking very similar to the bronze statuettes, possibly representing ancient Sardinia's warrior aristocracy, are known today as the Giants of Monte Prama. A total of 44 are thought to have once existed, though only a handful have been successfully put back together, including statues of nuragis, castles of the day. Discovered on the sea-facing Sinis Peninsula on the west of the island, where we know from pottery that Mycenaean Greeks and possibly Philistines had already long established a presence by the 12th century BC, it's at least possible that the power of these individuals came from their links across the sea. So then, it's not too much of a stretch to imagine an upwardly mobile warrior aristocracy ruling here, dispatching raids to Egypt. Another hypothesis is that sea peoples actually migrated here around the 13th or 12th centuries, after their failed invasion of Egypt. Though not conclusive, the evidence is striking. These bronze statuettes on Sardinia, dating from around the 12th century BC onwards, look very similar to depictions of sea peoples in Egyptian art. There is even an early Iron Age Phoenician inscription from the city of Nora bearing the word Surdon. Very similar statues with horned helmets appear on Cyprus too, the place named as the starting point for the Great Mustering against Egypt in the 12th century BC. And then there are the shreds of written evidence. Unfortunately, all coming from a much later age, though much closer to the Bronze Age than our time. Both Simonides of Chios and Plutarch speak of raids by Sardinians against the island of Crete, in the same era as the invasions of the Sea Peoples. Though the evidence is far from conclusive, the site of El Awat in Israel has even been suggested as an attempt at a nuragi building by Sardinians, settled in Canaan as pharaonic mercenaries. Finally, and maybe one of the most important pieces of evidence of all, is the role of anchors found along the Sardinian shore. The only remains left of ancient sea vessels. For historian Pierluigi Montalbano, these nuragic anchors suggest the existence of highly efficient ships, reaching lengths of up to 15 meters, thus explaining the widespread links of Sardinia with the outer world. So then, Sardinia may well have been the homeland of the Surdon. But of the western seaways, surely it wasn't only Sardinia that spawned sea people. "30 years before the fateful battle on the Nile, Ramses III's father sat on the imperial throne. He'd just waged a lengthy civil war to claim it, founding a new dynasty and proclaiming himself as the pharaoh Meneptah. Gone were the glory days of Kadesh, however, as rot very much seeped in to the societies of the Bronze Age powers. And in around 1207 BC, enemy ships came bearing down on the Egyptian coast, accompanied by a much more numerous horde of Libyans following the hidden oases from the western desert. Originating in the neighbouring region of Cyrenaica, a relatively fertile land, the warlike Meshwesh engaged themselves in a near-perpetual state of battle with Egypt during the 19th and 20th dynasties. Generation after generation, their warriors would head east to try their luck. No doubt enjoying some success, though left unrecorded by Egypt. Eventually, by the 10th century, the Meshwesh would succeed in their conquest, putting one of their own, Osorkon the Elder, on the pharaonic throne. In 1207 BC, however, the ruler who and this time he came with allies. An invasion force numbering tens of thousands come to topple the new Egyptian government. According to Meneptar's own inscriptions, these were the people of the island of Kos, the Luca, Shurdan, Tursinoi, Ekwesh and Shekelesh. In the ensuing bloodbath, Meneptar claims to have killed some 9,000 of the invaders, including more than 6,000 Libyans, the majority of the force. The pharaoh also claims to have killed 222 Shekelesh warriors, wanderers from the Great Green Sea, capturing others and hacking off their hands. And we have images of these Shekelesh standing out alongside the Teresh as wearing cloth headdresses, medallions on their chests, carrying spears with round shields. Perhaps they are these figures with horned helmets too, wearing Aegean-style kilts with pointed beards. One of the more widely noted of the Sea Peoples, the Shekelesh appear elsewhere too. They'd raided Egypt back in 1220 BC, and would do so again later in 1186 and 1184. And it may well be that it was them who were responsible for the destruction of Ugarit. According to a Hittite letter to the city, such was their ease at sea that they lived on ships. Today, the Shekelesh remain one of the most mysterious of the Sea Peoples, with very little concrete known about them. But who were they, and where did they come from? In 1984, just off the coast of Western Anatolia, one of the most significant Bronze Age finds ever made was discovered. Excavated between 1984 and 1994, this is the Ulabaran shipwreck, a 50-foot trading vessel, carrying a vast amount of exotic trade goods on board. Cargo from almost every nation in the Bronze Age world, and many from further afield. Aside elephant tusk and hippopotamus ivory, enough bronze ingots were found here to fully equip and arm an entire army of 300 men, armour and all. Or thousands of swords. Copper was found from Cyprus, and all items found. It's been surmised that as many as 4 Cypriots or Canaanites may have been on board. Perhaps middlemen working on behalf of whoever the vessel belonged to. Alongside 2 fully kitted out Mycenaean warriors. Bodyguards, perhaps, hired to protect the cargo. Some of the most interesting finds on board, however, are an Italian-style sword and mace. perhaps evidence of at least one armed individual from outside the eastern Mediterranean, serving on board a trading vessel. Just maybe from the island of Sicily. For decades, scholars such as N.K. Sanders have favoured a Sicilian or at least southeast Italian origins for the Shekelesh. At the time of the Late Bronze Age, like Sardinia, a flourishing archaeological culture. We know that in mainland Italy, this was a time of great upheaval and population displacement, as the highly martial Central European culture known as the Urnfield moved ever southwards down the peninsula, leaving rich archaeological finds in their wake. Predecessors to the Etruscans, Celts, and Romans, this was population movement, or at least cultural expansion, which surely had a knock-on effect on the earlier cultures of the peninsula. In truth, there is very little evidence to go on. Although, in mythology, there are many half-remembered mentions of movement from around this time. And if Sardinians were involved in the Late Bronze Age collapse, then why not Sicilians? Another maritime land with far-reaching ties to the outer world. During the 12th and 13th centuries BC, Sicily was far from a cut-off place. The Uluburun shipwreck may well have been a state-sponsored ship, but it does shed light on the larger network of sailors plying the seas for themselves, rather than on behalf of overlords. And just maybe, a Shekelesh merchant with origins in Sicily found himself in service on an eastern trading vessel. Surely others too ran their own ships. So then, we have to ask the question, what would people having such knowledge of the sea do in hard times, as trade from the east dried up and warlike people increasingly encroached on their land? It's mentioned all the time in the works of Homer too, recalling a culture of seaborne raiding during this same era. But by around 1180 BC, the situation had changed, when just 7 ships arrived from the sea to raid the lands of Ugarit. Once possessing a mighty navy, its king, Amurapi, could do little but hastily scrawl a letter to his ally, the King of Cyprus.
My father, now the ships of the enemy have been coming. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Doesn't my father know that all of my infantry and chariotry is stationed in Hatti, and that all my ships are stationed in the land of Lucca? Now the 7 ships of the enemy which have been coming have done harm to us. Now if other ships of the enemy turn up, send me a report somehow, so that I will know.
So, the navy and army of Ugarit were both away, fighting on foreign soil. But why? And who are the Lucca? Of course, the Lucca are another of the sea peoples, mentioned in the Egyptian sources. And this shred of evidence from Ugarit could be construed as an attempt to defend the passage from the Aegean to Anatolia's southern coast, and the Levant beyond. a last stand against the Sea Peoples. No depictions exist of the Luca, but they show up in the written record in abundance. In 1274 BC, they were at Kadesh, fighting not alongside the Shurden and Egypt, but in the armies of the Hittite king, alongside 18 other vassal states. In 1210 BC, they raided Egypt, and in 1207 took part in the massive invasion during Meneptar's reign, who claimed to have killed 200 of them. Most interesting of all, however, is that we know almost certainly where Lucca was. Today, it's called Lycia. An enigmatic land of dry hilltops and ancient tombs hewn into cliff faces. In the far west of modern-day Turkey. Ruined cities and monoliths here litter the dusty ground. But for the most part, these were built long after the collapse. Remnants of a later classical world. For the ancient Bronze Age Lycians, ancestors of those later city builders, in truth, we know very little. There are no named Lucca kings in Hittite records, which do name many rulers of neighbouring lands, suggesting Lucca to be a realm of petty chieftains, for the most part lacking political authority. The Lycians left no written records of themselves at all from this period, suggesting that they were probably illiterate. Much like most of the Greek world, only court scribes having the ability to write. This was very much on the fringe of the civilized world. After the collapse of the Hittite Empire, Lycia emerged as a so-called Neo-Hittite kingdom. Though Indo-European in origin like the Hittites, their culture was far from Hittite, and they are thought to have spoken a form of Luwian, the same language spoken by a variety of Hittite vassals in Anatolia. Frequently mentioned by Homer as an ally of Troy, another probable Hittite vassal often argued to have spoken Luwian. Their contingent to the Trojan War being led by the warriors Sarpedon and Glaucus, a son of Zeus and a son of Hippocoulus, respectively. Lycians also appear elsewhere in Greek myth, such as in the story of Bellerophon, who eventually succeeded to the throne of the Lycian king. Long considered pirates by the great powers of the time, fleets of Lucca often launched seaborne raids on the Mycenaean world, as well as their own Hittite overlords. Sporadically forced into vassalage by the waxing and waning power of the Hittite king. We know that in the late 15th century, the Lucca formed part of an anti-Hittite coalition alongside 22 other nations, known as the League of Assua. Ultimately crushed by the Hittite king Tudaliah I. We know the Lucca were a feared people. There is a Hittite prayer which talks of the Lucca attacking Hittite lands, along with other peoples, as well as denouncing the Hittite sun goddess Arena. Perhaps most notable of their victims, however, was Alasea, the island of Cyprus. where they made near-yearly attacks towards the end of the Bronze Age. Just maybe drawing the navy of Ugarit away to their doom. Earlier too, their piratical raids were feared. The Amarna letters included a plea from the king of Alasea against the Luca, to which the pharaoh Akhenaten assures Alasea that he is not siding with the Luca. A 14th century Hittite text talks of a petty king in western Anatolia named Madawata, ruling over an unknown nation, who attempted to expand his domains in Anatolia to rule over the sea in Alasea, much to the anger of his Hittite overlord. This would suggest that Madawata had ships at his disposal. It's possible these in part or in whole included Luca, either hailing from or at least staging their piratical raids from Lycia. For the most part, the Egyptian records describe the Luca as allies of the Hittites. However, as we've seen, this was far from always being the case. Probably only happening when Hatti was strong. When Hatti was weak, its western Anatolian vassals, forced into submission only by martial prowess, ran wild. In archaeology, depictions of hedgehog-helmed warriors, also depicted in Egyptian sources, found around this region, are the earliest examples of such a type of outfit. Seen 25 years earlier than their appearance in Egypt. So, there's a good argument that in the 12th century BC, spurred on either by catastrophe, simple opportunity, or a combination of both, these warriors spread out from southwestern Anatolia and the Dodecanese, westward to the Aegean, and then finally south and eastward to Cyprus and the Levant. Though it's unclear whether these were Luca, outside people from the Aegean coming into the area before moving on, or a combination of both. Political events at the time definitely made the situation viable for pirates. Now, we must take a closer look at the collapse of the Hittites, the empire that defeated Ramses at Kadesh. When a superpower dies, it rarely goes down quietly. After his victory at Kadesh, Hattusili's son, Tudaliya IV, was the last strong Hittite king. It wasn't just the west and the south that he had to contend with, but the east too. For there, to the north of Babylon, existed one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, Assyria, of late on the warpath. Though still a world power and able to keep the Assyrians out of his heartlands, over the course of the 13th century, Tudaliya lost many border regions, notably being heavily defeated at the Battle of Nerea by the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta. Tudaliya conquered Cyprus briefly, before it fell under Assyrian control. During the time of his successor, Suppiluliuma II, however, everything began to unravel. Though he reclaimed Cyprus in a naval battle against Alasea, the Assyrians, under Ashur-resh-ishi, annexed much Hittite territory in Asia Minor and Syria, driving out and defeating the Babylonian king in the process, who also had eyes on Hittite lands. The picture we get is a confused one, of war after war, and increasingly societal breakdown, famine, disaster. A situation ripe for outside invasion. As we have already seen, the Highland Hittite Empire was particularly susceptible to drought, surrounded on all sides by enemies. Its location was great in good times, terrible in bad ones. Now vulnerable to attack from all directions, faced by a combined onslaught of new invaders from the north, traditionally named as the Kaskas, Phrygians and Burges. Around 1180 BC, the capital city of Hattusha was burned to the ground. Every other city in the empire would soon follow, the kingdom vanishing from the historical record. Now we turn to the most elusive of all sea peoples, the Karkisha. All we have is a name. A name mentioned as attacking Egypt in 1207 BC, but also as a Hittite vassal at Kadesh, fighting alongside 18 other loyal nations. One other shred of information from the Hittite archives talks of Karkisha, specifically with King Muwatalli sending aid to this land, which spiralled temporarily into a small rebellion before they were brought back in line. The image we get, like the Luca, is one of a client state, loyal only when it suited them to be. Most often, Karkisha is equated with Caria, a neighbouring land to Lucca on the southwestern tip of Anatolia. However, there is another argument too, that at least some of the sea peoples could well have been Hittites themselves, remnants of a destroyed world, kingdomless, desperate, in search of a new home. Further west still, beyond the Hittite vassals of Anatolia, lay the outermost of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. This is Mycenaean Greece, home to a palatial culture of chariot-riding warrior lords, served by literate scribes and loyal retainers. Hilltop citadels overlooking a mass of peasantry in the plains below. This was a rich world of colossal masonry, hard-fought battles, and sea-spanning commerce. Gradually revealed over the last 200 years through archaeology and literary analysis of the epic poetry written about it in future generations. For the Late Bronze Age is the era of the Trojan War.